or Terras are forced for other reasons, then Miraidon could really quickly start looking like an imposing and unstoppable offensive threat.
Well, let's see if Trick Room is going to play a big role as we head into game number 1 of this best of 3 at round 14 of Swiss. It's going to be Lunala and Amoonguss to kick things off here for Andrew, and Joseph is going to start with the Miraidon and the Incineroar.
The Trick Room is threatened immediately here. Lunala should be able to take a hit from Miraidon instead of Trick Room if it needs to, and Amoonguss can try to redirect, and it's something like a knockoff away from Incineroar, or if not faked out, can redirect a Miraidon attack away. So if Andrew wants the Rage Powder plus Trick Room play, it's here. But then would still have to deal with both of these Pokemon in Trick Room. The other option is just to have Lunala immediately go out on the offense with Meteor Beam and try to pluck off the Incineroar like we talked about earlier.
Well, it's going to be a Rage Powder. Because there's no safety goggles, both of the attacks from Joe's Pokemon are going to get redirected, one of which is going to be this huge Draco Meteor. It's just going to be able to get the one shot on this Amoonguss. Even though it drops the special attack of this Miraidon, what a small price to pay to get rid of such a pesky Pokemon. And the U-turn into Lunala as well allows this Incineroar to break the Shadow Shield of this Lunala and also allow Joe to pivot in something else that could be able to take advantage of the Trick Room if he's expecting it to go up. One of which is the Farigiraf that we were talking about, having the opportunity to reverse the Trick Room and also get this defense boost from the Electric Seed. Yep, Trick Room going up too. I mean, Farigiraf just feels like it's in such a good position here.
Farigiraf does feel like it's come in at just the right moment. There were a lot of opportunities for Joe in that first turn. The Draco Meteor to KO Amoonguss is huge, takes away a redirection option, takes away a thorn in the side. Anytime you're having to fight in Trick Room against Amoonguss, it's difficult, even if you have Electric Terrain preventing the spores. Getting the KO with that meant there was also the option for knockoff into Lunala that would have done a ton of damage and gotten rid of the Power Herb, but electing just for the U-turn to break the Shadow Shield and land the Farigiraf here where it's able to quickly reverse this Trick Room.
And not to mention, now you have the opportunity to just kind of, maybe even sacrifice this Whimsicott here if you want to, knowing it's going to potentially take 2 attacks. But the foul play from this Farigiraf, just being comfortable to deal with these Trick Room conditions and getting a decent chunk of damage down now that that Shadow Shield is broken. And this Lunala does have that Power Herb, so it can go for this Meteor Beam, get that special attack boost. But is it going to hit the target? This is not a 100% accurate move, but it does this time around. And so the Farigiraf, dealing some good chip, but getting taken out in the process.
Ultimately, Farigiraf was not able to reverse the Trick Room there, even if it had tried, because there was enough damage coming in from Andrew's side. The Amoonguss going down gave free entry for the Raging Bolt, with which the Electric Terrain had a ton of damage threatened by Thunderbolt, and with 2 special attackers on the field, the Electric Seed wasn't helping Farigiraf at all. It does cost Lunala the Power Herb to make it happen, which makes this Incineroar a lot more difficult to deal with. But ultimately, now the Trick Room is locked in. We have the turn of it going up, the turn where Farigiraf goes down. That means there's 3 more turns that just is going to have to play inside of Trick Room, and there's not a way to reverse it at this point.
Right now, too, with the Whimsicott on the other side, Joe got a chance to get this in free. It still has the Focus Sash intact, so it could take an attack here. And it's nice that it has the opportunity to just go for something like the Moonblast into this Raging Bolt. The Raging Bolt's Terra type is going to be electric, so it can get some pretty powerful electric type attacks down. And it can Thunderclap, knowing that that Farigiraf is not available anymore to block those priority attacks with the Armor Tail.
The Electric Terrain helps Raging Bolt really threaten a lot of damage and will have the speed advantage. Of course, also if Miraidon gets back on the field, Raging Bolt can just switch it up to Draco Meteor and threaten a KO onto Raging Bolt.
Well, here is the Terra. It is going to go on to Joe's Incineroar. So it does get the Grass typing. It's going to allow itself to resist some of these attacks in from the Raging Bolt, and it's just going to allow it to get a bit more utility on the field.
Both Terastallizations used this turn. The Lunala also going to be using its Terastallization to turn into a Grass type and make sure it doesn't take massive damage from the knockoff that the Incineroar was threatening, for example.
That is a much smaller Terra Hat. I just have to point out. It's a much smaller Terra Hat, but it's actually going to get locked into an Encore. So one way that you can get a little bit more staying power in Trick Room is just if you have the ability to go for something with that Prankster, and Thunderbolt now just going to clap back a little bit, but you are stuck now as Lunala having to go for Meteor Beam, and with that power being spent, you're stuck for at least another turn before you're able to actually land that Meteor Beam.
This is a really interesting play. You have to imagine Andrew was expecting to just get 2 hits into Whimsicott, try to get a KO there, force Miraidon onto the field to try to deal with it before Trick Room was expired. But the Encore to Meteor Beam delays that for another couple turns. But you're also giving more boosts over to Lunala. As a grass type, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. If Incineroar tries to U-turn and chip in damage that way, that's also going to force Miraidon on the field still with time left in Trick Room and Choice Specs, and so no chance to protect.
Well, Whimsicott's going to protect this turn, is in a bit of danger of getting taken out by this Raging Bolt, but it's the Flare Blitz from the Incineroar. You don't even need the super effective knockoff if that Grass Terra type is going to make you vulnerable to this Flare Blitz. So a huge KO here for Joe to grab while this Trick Room is nearing its end. Even though this Incineroar does have to take a little bit of chip damage, you can see how this Grass Terra on the Incineroar is going to be really handy to deal with this Raging Bolt, except it has that secondary effect of paralyzing that Incineroar.
Ursaluna now comes in with very little time left in this Trick Room. Probably Andrew would have had a stronger offensive presence in this Trick Room had Ursaluna been there earlier, but now it's gone on a very short timer because once Miraidon comes out on the field, it's going to be threatening a Draco Meteor that should just KO. And meanwhile, Whimsicott is still being a nuisance, able to disrupt with Encore and force another Thunderbolt into 2 grass-type attackers.
Oh, and the knockoff as well into the Ursaluna. The Paralyze is not going to affect this Incineroar enough. So Ursaluna losing the Flame Orb does not have an opportunity to actually gain that status effect. Whimsicott, though, even locking that Raging Bolt into the Encore with the Thunderbolt, it's gonna get taken down in the process, but it means that this Miraidon is going to have a fantastic resist, knowing that the Electric Terrain is just expired and it gets to come back in to reset that. But it still has to deal with this Ursaluna, though.
It's really 1 turn too late. If Andrew would have been able to force Miraidon onto the field 1 turn earlier without the ability to protect itself, it would have been so vulnerable to a Raging Bolt Draco Meteor, especially with the Terastallization already spent on Incineroar. But now Miraidon hits the field with Trick Room already expired. It has its choice of targets. Can just Draco Meteor this Raging Bolt, which also cannot protect itself, is encored into Thunderbolt and holding an Assault Vest. Can just threaten a KO there. You leave Ursaluna to deal with in the future, but Ursaluna has been really weakened by having its Flame Orb knocked off and not able to get burnt and boosted facades off.
Well, it's going to be the Draco Meteor from the Miraidon, and it's into this Ursaluna. It buys Andrew a little bit of time to try to get some chip damage down into this Incineroar, because it is going to be the hardest target to take off of the field. But the knockoff comes through. It is going to remove the Assault Vest from this Raging Bolt. But critically, you're looking at the Ursaluna now, having a juicy opportunity in front of this Electric-type Miraidon to try to go for something like an Earthquake. But as you mentioned, the Raging Bolt can't protect. You're kind of hoping that you're going to take something down with it in the process.
Raging Bolt stuck using Thunderbolt, and Joe able to just rely on that Encore to make sure the Miraidon isn't under threat from that slot. Means you can use Draco Meteor to make sure the Ursaluna isn't a threat. The double protect from Ursaluna buys Andrew a little bit of time to try to get rid of this Incineroar and get out from under the Encore.
But the Draco Meteor, once again, trying to land into that target. So Andrew, with such a critical double protect, buys his Raging Bolt enough time to get the knockout onto the Incineroar. And just like that, it's just the Miraidon. Miraidon still has a lot of power, but losing an opportunity twice to secure a knockout into either the Ursaluna or the Raging Bolt has allowed this Encore to expire.
Crucially, the Encore expiring means that the 2 damaging single target attacks can just come out, and ultimately the Draco Meteor misses. The Ursaluna isn't damaged. Joe doesn't get either of his targets as the Draco Meteor lands into Miraidon, picks up the KO, and Andrew comes back and wins this game 1.
Wow, what a series of unfortunate events there for Joseph at the end of that game number 1. I mean, hats off to Andrew, because you have to play to those types of outs. Not landing the double protect there makes things look a little bit differently, but still got it in the end.
Understood what the outs were. That giving up Ursaluna would have not left a way back in. Eventually, the Incineroar and the Miraidon would have dealt with Raging Bolt, so able to protect that Pokemon over the course of a couple of turns, and knew that there was light at the end of the tunnel once that Encore was expired. And Andrew was able to threaten 2 one-hit KOs onto the Miraidon, either the Headlong Rush or the Draco Meteor. The one of them was going to have to hit, and ultimately it was the Draco Meteor that picked up the KO in the Miraidon.
And nice to have that single target damage as well. And I think, like, too, Joe still played around this super well. Got a chance to get that Whimsicott in for free, had the Prankster Encore, able to lock that Lunala into the Meteor Beam without having access to that Power Herb. And then you also got a chance to lock this Raging Bolt into Thunderbolt. So you weren't doing much damage to either the Incineroar or the Miraidon while the Encore was still intact.
Joe, I think did a great job, like you mentioned, disrupting the Trick Room. Really caused a lot of turns to be wasted. But because of the 4 Pokemon that he brought in order to try to disrupt that Trick Room, the Whimsicott, Incineroar, and Frigoraph, not big offensive threats. Incineroar did have a valuable offensive role in that game, forced to Terrestrialization from Lunala and then KO'd anyway with the Flare Blitz. But it left so much of the offensive requirement onto Miraidon. Miraidon had to go for a Draco Meteor for big KO and then get off the field to reset its special attack because the only offensive path of the game was for Joe was getting that Miraidon back in later. And then it needed to go for a couple of more Draco Meteors to close the game, and it was just probably too much to ask of Miraidon at the end of that game.
Yeah, I mean, at the third time was the charm. It just missed it completely. And sometimes that's what happens when you have to open yourself up to those types of end games. But as we enter into this second game of this best of 3, Joe is going to lead with the Miraidon and the Incineroar, and for Andrew, it's going to be the Raging Bolt and the Lunala.
A shift up. There's no longer the Amoonguss there, but the Raging Bolt, similarly a valuable target for Draco Meteor if Joe just wants to throw one in that direction. But no redirection available also means Lunala looks a lot more vulnerable here. Something like Volt Switch and Knockoff would just KO Lunala if it doesn't go for a Terrestrialization.
Yeah, and similarly on the other side, like Joe has the opportunity to use Terrestrialization as well, either for the Incineroar in order to remove its weakness to that Meteor Beam, or to help boost up those attacks from the Miraidon. But a smart defensive choice here from Joe, knowing that that Meteor Beam is an option.
A way to disrupt the Knockoff plus Volt Switch combination, or just punishing the Incineroar after this Draco Meteor that one-hit KO's Raging Bolt would have been the Meteor Beam into Incineroar. That option's not there, and Raging Bolt is down.
Raging Bolt is a huge piece for Joe to have removed so early. Unlike the Amoonguss that we saw in that game number 1, I feel like the Raging Bolt was so much more impactful. And so having that key piece taken out means that you don't get a chance to utilize this electric terrain anymore, and even have that one-shot potential onto the Miraidon. This Meteor Beam actually still does a pretty good amount of damage there to that Incineroar, but in a similar turn of events, Joe gets, in this game, a turn 1 knockout plus a pivot from this Incineroar, and breaks the Shadow Shield.
Shadow Shield is down. Once again, though, there's not much offensive pressure on this following turn from Joe's side. It's Whimsicott on the field to try to be disruptive, and Miraidon already at -2 special attack and locked into Draco Meteor. The Incineroar took actually less than 50% from that Meteor Beam, didn't take that much. I think it's good knowledge for both players that the one-hit KO then isn't available. Meteor Beam will just miss that KO and let Incineroar attack, and Joe doesn't necessarily even have to use a Terrestrialization to prevent it if we were to go to a Game 3.
It is nice to know that Assault Vest might be helping with that calculation there, but you can also sort of play around that. As the Incineroar starts to move back in, it does get an Intimidate drop pretty crucially onto this Ursaluna that took that Raging Bolt's place, but Lunala also wants to get out of dodge. So we're going to see the reveal of that 4th and final Pokemon for Andrew in that Amoonguss on this turn.
So it's the same Pokemon, just in a different order. Amoonguss comes out of the back next to Ursaluna. Whimsicott tries an Encore, but Andrew does not want to get stuck in a Meteor Beam this time.
Oh, and the Headlong Rush, though. This is going to be in some dangerous territory, because as Ursaluna continues to go for the single target attacks with that Headlong Rush, it is going to start taking defense and special defense drops. But this time around, it is going to get the burn from that Flame Orb that the Incineroar knocked off in that first game.
The burn means that Ursaluna will have a lot more consistent offensive power, but like you mentioned, the special defense drop and the lack of Trick Room means that it may be a lot more difficult for Ursaluna to actually get those attacks off. Things are going to start very quickly threatening KOs. Not these two Pokemon, though. Whimsicott and Incineroar can do a lot of damage together. Maybe with a double up could deal with Ursaluna, but definitely not also deal with an Amoonguss on the other side. Of course, both are grass types right now, so they're not able to be redirected by Rage Powder. So the Ursaluna does feel a little bit vulnerable and protects itself on this turn.
Good to at least know that you're going to keep yourself safe from this Moonblast that this Whimsicott was sending in that Ursaluna's direction. But even though this Amoonguss can't do things like Spore, oh, the Flare Blitz as well to stop the double up. That's a huge protect here from Andrew to be able to call both of those targets. And with the Amoonguss being able to go for the Pollen Puff, it puts this Incineroar on a really small timer. Even one more Headlong Rush would for sure be able to pick it off.
But how do you get to the one more Headlong Rush? I think it's a really crucial missed KO for Andrew, because that double up of the Moonblast and the Flare Blitz that goes past Rage Powder is still available in the next turn. Both of those attacks are going to go off before either Ursaluna or Amoonguss moves, which is going to force this switch that you're seeing Andrew lock in of going into the Lunala just to make sure that Ursaluna isn't so easily given up. That's a huge advantage for Joe, to be able to be forcing switches and having a big offensive threat that's disrupting your opponent with just the Whimsicott and the Incineroar. Being able to have that kind of impact before Miraidon hits the field again, when you know you're going to get one more wave of having the offensive like ownership of the game and the momentum as soon as Miraidon hits the field another time. It's like being one step ahead.
It was tough though too, because like now you are gonna lock this Ursaluna into an Encore. And so that does not feel great as the knockoff going to knock off the Flame Ward, but it's still going to do more damage because that Ursaluna was actually holding an item, and now it has to protect. A really weird series of events there, quite honestly, as the Pollen Puff at least breaks the Focus Sash on this Whimsicott.
Joe doesn't go for the knockoff plus Moonblast, maybe not trusting that it would KO, and of course with Protect on the previous turn, Encore into a Protect works just as well to make sure that Andrew can't attack. The Amoonguss doesn't pick up the KO on Incineroar again this turn either, just tries to get the Sash broken on this Whimsicott and start chipping a little bit more damage, but things look more and more difficult for Andrew. Now Ursaluna locked into Protect, can't do anything but protect itself this turn, and it's going to be so risky to try to get out to Lunala when the Incineroar is just ready and waiting to pounce on that switch.
Yeah, a target into the Ursaluna slot just feels good regardless. You still have to deal with this Amoonguss, but this Amoonguss isn't necessarily the biggest offensive threat. The Pollen Puff would be able to pick it off, but this Protect is not going to happen a second time, and the Whimsicott is going to lock this Amoonguss down with yet another Encore. So the Flare Blitz from this Incineroar is going to do enough to get the KO. It will KO itself in the process thanks to the recoil, but now this Miraidon gets a chance to come in for free in front of this Lunala.
Ursaluna failing the Protect there meant that Incineroar was able to find the damage, get it taken down, and lock Andrew to the final 2 Pokemon.
With the Pollen Puff though, at least you're still doing a bit of damage, but you know, I think that would still be a 3-hit knockout. Maybe you're able to help it out a little bit more with this Lunala, but because the Lunala had to leave the field, you're losing that boost that you ended up getting from that Meteor Beam earlier on. You were so scared of the Encore.
Joe is one step ahead with this Encore as well. Having Amoonguss stuck into Pollen Puff right now makes things so much more difficult for Andrew. He'd love to be able to Rage Powder away a giant Electro Drift from this Miraidon and keep Lunala safe, but that option isn't there. Amoonguss is going to be stuck just Pollen Puffing for likely the remainder of this game, which leads Lunala on an island by itself. Lunala, a very bulky Pokemon, but Choice Specs Miraidon Electro Drift is a very powerful attack.
It sure is. Even though you know that the Defensive Terra is available for this Lunala, that you can turn yourself into a grass type, is that going to be enough to save you?
It shouldn't be enough to prevent the KO. And Pollen Puff, now being used on the partner side to try to heal, might be able to undo a lot of it, but if it's a Draco Meteor coming in instead, it could still be a KO, and Whimsicott can try to just mount damage as well with Moonblast.
Oh, it's just going to be the Electro Drift. May as well lead into that big offensive power that this Miraidon has without decreasing your own special attack. And so that Grass Terra, enough to be able to keep this Lunala safe for now, but the Moonblast just helping to soften up this Lunala, and it gets that special attack drop. So the Moongeist beam that's going to come out of this Lunala is not going to pack nearly as much punch. You can see it with that kind of effect that's going to have on this Miraidon. The Amoonguss with the Pollen Puff into the Lunala is going to help at least restore a bit of HP, but you're still a knockout of Electro Drift range.
I think absolutely. If not the Electro Drift, definitely the Electro Drift plus Moonblast. There's no Protect available from Lunala. It is just vulnerable on this turn. The Pollen Puff isn't enough recovery to get Lunala safe. So even if you hadn't gotten the special attack drop off onto Lunala and you were threatening a KO onto Miraidon, there's no way to get that extra Moongeist Beam off. It's just going to be a KO here from the Electro Drift all by itself.
And that means that this Pollen Puff does not have a good target for it anymore. There was a critical hit there, but I don't know how much that actually matters in the grand scheme of things, knowing that this Whimsicott is still faster than what that Lunala would be able to provide, and with the Moonblast as that secondary follow-up from Joe, this Amoonguss is going to get whittled down a little bit, but it's just too difficult for this Amoonguss to have to get through not only the Miraidon and the Whimsicott, but yet a fourth and final Pokemon for Joe that is yet to be revealed.
Joe played this game expertly, controlled what trades Andrew was willing to make, really used Whimsicott. Despite on Team Preview feeling like you might not need Whimsicott because you don't need the speed advantage, using the Encore to be so disruptive and cause Andrew a ton of problems that let Joe control this game. And so many aspects of the game were so well timed. Miraidon came back in right as Electric Terrain expired, which meant that it could continue to have Electric Terrain boosted moves throughout this in-game. And just expertly played, having to give up so little to work through Andrew's team.
And this is smart though. I mean, Andrew's still playing to the out that this Electric Terrain could expire. That would take away quite a bit of this Miraidon's output. but this Encore from the Whimsicott is going to lock it into just continuing to have to go for these protects. It's going to fail this time around, but it's still a timer on this Amoonguss, knowing that it's not able to actually get any damage out with a Pollen Puff of its own. The Rocky Helmet recoil helping a little bit with this Miraidon, but it's only a matter of time before we will see Joe finish up this game, whether it's a Moonblast or yet another Electro Drift.
Whimsicott ready to add one more disruptive, annoying Encore to the mix with the game already well in hand. Just a matter of time now for Joe to land that final hit and KO Amoonguss and move us into a Game 3.
Yep, and even though you do get a chance to see this Electric Terrain expire, Amoonguss does not have nearly enough health left, and it's going to fail this second double protect it's gone for. So with the Electric Drift from the Miraidon, that is the final move in this game number 3, getting the knockout, and let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Really well played.
Really well played game by Joe to make the trades that he needed to and keep kind of control of the game. I think there's two really interesting aspects looking into Game 3 that I want to focus on. The first is whether Andrew will go for Trick Room again. In the game he won, it was Trick Room went up, but it didn't actually feel like the Trick Room was a huge part of how he won that game. Joe was capably able to disrupt it with a lot of Encores, and Andrew ended up taking game-deciding KOs after Trick Room was expired. But the other big factor that's been happening in these games is the turn 1 advantage that Joe is getting. Both games have featured a huge Draco Meteor one-hit KO on turn 1. If Andrew can find a way to lead something a little bit more stable, knowing that there's no reason for Joe to stop leading Miraidon and stop firing off these giant attacks, then he's going to have a much more even ground to play with from there. But having to play every game from down 3-4 is really difficult.
It is hard, and I think in this situation too, maybe even taking a different turn 1 approach for Andrew could have been different. Instead of going for the Meteor Beam into the Incineroar, you now have confirmation that the Incineroar would not get knocked out to the Meteor Beam, even if it was not Terra'd, but you also know that maybe instead you go for something like the Trick Room.
I think a combination where you give up the KO to Draco Meteor, get a Trick Room, and have Ursaluna instantly on the field is probably Andrew's best offensive option. In Game 1, it was instead the Raging Bolt that came on the field in that position. It was a little bit harder to deal with the double grass types that Joe presented once it was Raging Bolt and Lunala on the field, because Lunala just doesn't have that same kind of offensive presence as a restricted Pokemon like Miraidon, and it relies on partners like Ursaluna to do it. Game 2, it was Ursaluna immediately hitting the field and getting the Flame Orb and the Guts Burn, but never having the speed advantage. I mean, it had to play much more defensively. It had to protect itself from a double target from Whimsicott and Incineroar, which just meant that Protect could get Encored, and a couple turns later, Joe has a decisive lead. And so I think it has to be a little bit more decisive one direction or the other, all in on the offense and the Trick Room, or finding a way to play it a little bit more slowly.
Yeah, so there is an opportunity here where you could potentially just sacrifice the Raging Bolt. It is still going to be slower than this Miraidon, as we see a run back of the same leads we saw in that game number 2 for this third and final game between Joseph Ugarte and Andrew Briceno.
The scary thing is that Joe loves his reads, loves to try to be one step ahead, and that play of breaking Shadow Shield with Miraidon and then going for a knockoff is still there. A Trick Room could still be very dangerous.
It could, but here is a big switch up for Andrew to make, and that is going to be this Electric Terastallization onto the Raging Bolt. You're removing its weakness to a Draco Meteor that could be incoming into that slot and trying to fire one right back. But Joe also has Terastallization, so that is going to be committed into the Incineroar to give it this Grass Terra once again. Just another fail-safe in case it was a Meteor Beam heading that way.
The Grass Terastallization really helps defensively against both of these Pokemon, so it makes a lot of sense, but it is a shift up. There's no Draco Meteor this time. It's Volt Switch coming out and breaking the Shadow Shield. Wow,
and that means that this Incineroar is free to just throw out a knockoff into that slot, knowing that this Terastallization was committed into the Raging Bolt. It's going to be a Whimsicott that's going to take that Miraidon's place, and that is a Fairy type. The Meteor Beam, though, from this Lunala instead gets a chance to fire off first. So I think you feel pretty good about the fact that you get a chance to get that special attack boost, but you now have to worry about the fact that this Whimsicott is going to sit there and be able to Encore you. So even though the Meteor Beam is going to do about half to this Draco Meteor, half to this Incineroar, Draco Meteor isn't going to affect this Whimsicott, and the knockoff is going to be enough to take out this Lunala and a huge turn of events for turn 1.
Joe absolutely one step ahead in this Game 3. The possibility of the Volt Switch knockoff play had been there since Game 1. Joe finally goes for it, and it gets way more than just the Volt Switch and knockoff, because Andrew is trying to react to the play from the last game, uses the Terastallization to make sure that the Raging Bolt wasn't vulnerable to Draco Meteor, and if it had been a Draco Meteor, Raging Bolt would have been able to respond with a Draco Meteor of its own into the Miraidon on the other side. Would have been a really great play into what Joe did last game, but a disastrous play into what Joe does this game. As the Volt Switch lands, breaks the Shadow Shield, gets Miraidon safely off the field to be replaced by Whimsicott, immune to the Draco Meteor, knockoff lands, the restricted Pokemon is gone, no Trick Room, and Andrew feels like he's in a corner after one turn.
Because we're back to this similar position where Whimsicott can just encore something. This Ursaluna is so slow compared to the rest of Joe's team, and there's no Trick Room yet again for this game number 2. So tough. And you're putting yourself into another position here where Whimsicott gets to encore the Raging Bolt this turn to force you to keep using Draco Meteor, but then threatens the encore into the Ursaluna to lock you into a Protect, and just time after time getting these calls correctly, as this Raging Bolt doesn't even get a chance to actually get the knockout on the Incineroar. It hangs on with just a sliver of HP.
This Incineroar is so bulky to be able to hang on to the Draco Meteor, and the combination of the Encore and knockoff are really pesky for this Ursaluna. It wants to protect for a turn to make sure it gets burnt by Flame Orb and has its full offensive presence, but if you protect for one turn to get that burn, well then the Encore is being threatened, and so this switch is forced, and you're continuing to play on the back foot while Joe already has a lead.
Ooh, and Tailwind as well for the Whimsicott. That is just going to ensure that Joe continues to keep that speed advantage. And the Incineroar calling the Flare Blitz into the Amoonguss. That is going to be able to do a huge chunk of damage.
Joe just stays one turn ahead at every turn. Look how this is going to play out. That Encore Draco Meteor now has to go into Whimsicott for no damage. The Tailwind makes sure that that Flare Blitz goes before the Draco Meteor that would have KO'd Incineroar, and Joe knows what Andrew's options are. Knows that he's not going to be willing to leave Ursaluna in to get Encored into Protect again, and Andrew has brought the same 4 Pokemon to both games, no shift up here, and so the Flare Blitz is called as Amoonguss comes in and gives up so much of its health bar.
And for Farigiraf as well as the 4th and final here for Joe. Might have still been in the back for that second game, but it's going to have that Electric Seed to deal with this Ursaluna that is still waiting in the wings. But Andrew is left with some very few options here.
This game's not over yet, though. Joe has relatively little damage output. Whimsicott can fire some Moonblast, but there's no super effective target with Raging Bolt having dropped its Dragon typing. Farigiraf not much of a damage threat at all here. If the Amoonguss can hang on in time for Raging Bolt to get switched out, or the Amoonguss is just going to switch out, there's still 2 big attackers from Andrew's side. We saw how the end of that game 1 landed, where just one window for Andrew to get an attack into Miraidon can shift the whole game. It's still a possibility in this game 3.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the Whimsicott, though, going to help to whittle away, but that Assault Vest really going to be able to keep this Raging Bolt safe as a Draco Meteor fires off into the Farigiraf, the only target that it has on the field, and this Raging Bolt is now down to -4. But because that Amoonguss is still preserved, you have an actual opportunity to make this Raging Bolt switch off the field, get rid of those special attack drops, and bring it back in.
Likely the Ursaluna is still threatened by a KO here. A combination of Moonblast plus Foul Play might be enough damage to pick up the KO into Ursaluna. If you just are switching out into Amoonguss while Ursaluna gets KO'd, that's going to be disastrous. But of course, protecting Ursaluna to try to get in Amoonguss is just setting yourself up for another Encore Protect turn. A really, really dangerous position. I think it's hard to find an avenue that's safe for Andrew, but no Protect, just an Encore back into Draco Meteor.
Yep, and so like Raging Bolt has to keep locking itself into these types of moves, but the Foul Play from this Farigiraf is able to chip away at this Ursaluna just a little bit, but the Farigiraf is going to avoid that Draco Meteor it just got locked into. The Facade, plenty to pick it up, so this Farigiraf is now removed from the field, and Joe down to just the Whimsicott and the Miraidon, but what a powerful duo to have next to each other.
Again, well timing the electric terrain, I think actually would have been very bad for Joe if Miraidon had not had electric terrain here, if it wants to lock into electric moves. Of course, that's dangerous if you have to deal with this Ursaluna. I don't think Joe has a decisive lead here. The Ursaluna demands attention because it's threatening a KO into Miraidon. The Raging Bolt can reset out and then threaten a Draco Meteor KO into Miraidon, and there's nothing that Whimsicott plus Miraidon can do to disrupt that Draco Meteor. Unless you think Moonblast plus Draco Meteor into the neutral target is enough damage to KO the Assault Vest Raging Bolt, but I don't think it is. Now the problem is, if you Draco Meteor the Miraidon and Whimsicott is still there, it can just Encore you into Draco Meteor and then deal with Miraidon itself. So you have to make sure there's a second attacker left, whether it's the Ursaluna still around to threaten damage into Whimsicott, or the Amoonguss threatening to try to close out the game against Whimsicott. There's definitely a path to getting rid of Miraidon here.
There is, and maybe even just getting a Draco Meteor crit. But the Draco Meteor from the Miraidon is going to land into the Ursaluna. So this Miraidon is also going to be dropping its special attack stat. With no more Pokemon in the back, Joe is forced to keep those special attack drops as the Whimsicott follows up that damage with a Moonblast of its own. Raging Bolt still getting chipped away here, but it's about whether or not this Draco Meteor can actually crit the Miraidon, and yes, it does! The super effective one-hit knockout that was Andrew's way back into this set win!
What a gutsy call to not try to find a way to get a neutral special attack Draco Meteor off, but just staying on the field, clicking the button, landing the Draco Meteor into Miraidon, getting the critical hit, and KOing the Miraidon. Now it's just Whimsicott against Amoonguss and Raging Bolt. There just isn't enough time in this game. The Pollen Puffs can heal back up Raging Bolt. The Pollen Puffs can slowly deal with Whimsicott, and Moonblast from Whimsicott is just going to do too little damage to Amoonguss. It's going to take quite a few of them to end this game, and so Joe sees the writing on the wall, concedes it, and Andrew takes the match.
That critical hit just completely changed the whole game. Especially when Raging Bolt was locked into it, had -6 special attack. That was the only out that Raging Bolt had in order to get Andrew that win, and it came to fruition.